The apartment had the wrong kind of quiet. Not the quiet of a house at rest, but the quiet of a house emptied, where sound fell to the floor and stayed there because there was nothing to catch it. The furniture was gone. The couch Daniel had carried up 3 flights, one end at a time because the stairs were too narrow for 2 people, was gone. The kitchen table where Lily had spread her homework for 4 years, where Marcus had learned to color inside lines, gone. The walls showed the pale ghosts of picture frames, rectangles of paint slightly less faded than what surrounded them, the way missing things announced themselves through absence. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. Nora Callahan sat on the floor with her back against the wall that used to hold the window seat Daniel built the second winter they lived here. He'd built it on a Saturday, Marcus helping by handing him screws one at a time with enormous seriousness, and Lily reading on the couch pretending not to watch but watching. The seat was gone now, carried down by the same consignment men who'd taken everything else, traded for $340 in credit against the $47 still in her checking account. She had $387 yesterday. The math of the last 2 days was simple and brutal. $40 for gas, $30 for groceries that were mostly gone, $22 to a mechanic to look at the Kia's check engine light, which turned out to be a loose sensor he fixed in 10 minutes but charged the diagnostic fee anyway. And she'd thanked him because the car needed to last, needed to get them wherever they were going after the marshal came at 9. She didn't know where they were going after 9. The Salvation Army shelter on Dewberry Street had a 14-day maximum stay and required ID documentation she had ready, but it also separated families by gender above age 12, which meant Lily would go to the women's side and Marcus would stay with Nora. And Lily had said fine in the voice she used when something was not fine at all, but arguing required energy she decided not to spend. Nora had called 3 other shelters. 2 were full. 1 had a spot, but only for single individuals, no children. There was her sister in Baton Rouge. Claire had offered twice, had meant it both times, but Claire's house had 3 bedrooms and Claire's husband Ray and their 2 kids already in 2 of them. And the math of 4 more people into 1 spare room was the kind of math that ended relationships. Nora had spent 3 months on Claire's couch after Daniel died, before she found this apartment, and she knew the particular sound of a household trying to accommodate more than it held. She'd heard it in the creak of floorboards when Ray crossed the hall at 5 in the morning and the thinness of his voice at breakfast, and the way Claire laughed a little too quickly at everything to keep the mood level. She wasn't going back to Claire's. She'd been a project manager for 11 years, the kind of consultant companies hired to untangle logistics that had grown past their systems and coordinate teams across time zones. She was good at it. She'd been good at it long enough to believe it was permanent, which turned out to be a more expensive belief than any she'd paid for. The company she worked for had gone under 4 months after Daniel's diagnosis, folding into bankruptcy proceedings that would drag on for years, taking her severance with them into the lawyer's hands. She'd cashed out the 401k, taken the penalty, paid what she could. Then the house. Then what the house left over. For the last 14 months, she'd been working nights at a commercial cleaning company, running a crew through office buildings after 10, coming home at 4 to sleep for 2 hours before the kids woke. Twice she'd taken temp work during the day on top of it, and twice she'd lasted about 3 weeks before something in her body simply refused. A person ran on fumes for a while. Eventually, even fumes ran out. The landlord, a man named Bertrand who owned 4 buildings in this neighborhood and managed all of them with more patience than the math probably required, had given her 9 months of reduced payments and 2 of deferred notice before filing. She did not resent him. She understood the math better than most people. The math was not personal. Daniel had been dead for 18 months. He died on a Tuesday morning in October, in the hospital bed they'd rented for the living room because the stairs to the bedroom were too much by the end. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed the previous November when he came home from a job site saying his back had been hurting for weeks and he'd finally seen a doctor. 11 months from diagnosis to burial. The doctors were honest about the odds. Nora respected them for it, even though honesty felt like a weapon at the time. The medical debt was $189,000 after insurance. The house, which they'd owned for 6 years and had $78,000 in equity, went to cover the bulk of it. The rest went on cards that were now in collections. They bought the house thinking they were building something permanent, the kind of thing you pass to your children. And then they were selling it to pay for the attempt to save their children's father, and Nora didn't regret it, had never regretted it. But the weight of that exchange sat in her chest like a stone that hadn't dissolved in 18 months and probably never would. Lily was 14. She'd been 12 when the diagnosis came, 13 when Daniel died, and the year between had aged her in ways that weren't visible and weren't invisible. She did her homework still, kept her grades where they'd been, walked Marcus to the bus stop every morning without being asked. But she'd stopped talking about the future the way she used to, the way 12-year-olds talk. About it as though adulthood were a destination they could already see the outline of. She didn't do that anymore. The future, Nora understood, had become something Lily was no longer certain about, and certainty was expensive, and Lily had learned to be careful with expensive things. Marcus was 8. He hadn't understood his father's death the way older children understood things, and he also hadn't not understood it. He'd gone through a phase at school 3 months after the funeral of telling classmates that his dad was working somewhere far away, and his teacher had called, gently, to ask if Nora knew. She'd known, had sat with Marcus that night on the floor of his room, and explained again that Dad wasn't working anywhere, that working somewhere would mean coming home eventually, that what had happened was different and permanent, and it was okay to be sad about it. Marcus had listened with his hands flat on the carpet, pressing down like he was checking that the floor was still there, and then he'd asked if they could have pancakes for dinner, and she'd said yes. He asked for pancakes when things were hard. She'd learned that early. Tonight he was asleep on his sleeping bag in the corner where his bed used to be, a stuffed bear pressed to his chest. Lily was asleep near the window, one arm over her eyes against light that wasn't there. Nora looked at her phone. 4:42 a.m. She'd slept for maybe 2 hours. The apartment floor was cold through the sleeping bag she'd been lying on, and the cold had woken her at 3, and she'd lain there for 45 minutes doing the math again, the same numbers arriving at the same answer they always did. Not enough. She stood, found her shoes by feel, walked to the window. 3 floors down, the street was quiet. The Kia sat at the curb with 2 duffel bags and 4 boxes in the back, everything that had survived the consignment sale, and the Goodwill drop, and the 2 things she'd given to neighbors. The kitchen stand mixer Daniel had bought her for her birthday 3 years ago, given to Mrs. Petrakis on the 2nd floor, and his collection of art books, given to Mr. Holloway across the hall, who taught high school and appreciated things being given rather than thrown. The art books had hurt. She'd kept 3, the ones with his handwriting in the margins, notes he'd made at different stages of learning to paint. She knew them by their spines. Daniel had painted on weekends, not professionally, but with the quiet seriousness the thing itself seemed to require of him. Landscapes mostly, places he'd been, and a few he'd invented. He read about painting the way some people read about history, at length, in the margins, returning to passages he'd already marked to see if he'd changed his mind. Lily had grown up standing at the garage door on Saturday mornings, asking him questions he always answered in full. Marcus had been too young for most of it, but he'd sat on the workbench watching the way children watch things they found naturally important, not understanding the vocabulary, but feeling the attention. Nora hadn't painted and hadn't pretended to, but she'd absorbed things through proximity. The way light behaved differently at different hours. What Daniel meant when he said a painting was technically correct, but not true. The particular way he talked about frames, about what they did to the thing inside them. How a frame was a kind of argument for taking something seriously. She'd given away the art books because carrying them felt too close to carrying him, and she needed her hands free. She'd kept the 3 annotated ones because getting rid of them felt too close to letting him go, and she wasn't ready for that either. The storage facility was 3 blocks north. She'd walked past it hundreds of times on the way to the grocery store. Red River Storage, the sign said, though there was no river within 20 miles and never had been, probably named by someone who liked the sound of it. The facility was small and slightly run down, the kind of place that existed in the middle space between the past and acquisition by a larger chain that would put up better lighting and charge double. The notice had come under her door 2 weeks ago. A single sheet, laser printed on paper that had probably been run through the printer slightly damp because the text had a faint waver to it. Abandoned unit auction. Unit 14. Unclaimed for 26 months. Deceased owner. No next of kin on file. Outstanding fees unresolved. Entry bid, $5. Auction time, 7 a.m. November 14th. Today was November 14th. She hadn't planned to go. The $5 felt necessary for other things. But at 4:42 a.m., on the floor of an empty apartment with the marshal coming at 9 and 2 sleeping children and $47, she thought, I have 3 hours and nothing to do with them. She thought about something Daniel used to say, that the worst thing that could happen was usually not as bad as you expected, which had turned out to be spectacularly wrong as life advice, but had also, in small ways, been occasionally true. She thought, $5, and the unit might have something worth selling. That was all. Not hope exactly, nothing as clean as hope. Just the arithmetic of having nothing better to do at 5 in the morning and a lock key waiting at the end of it. She made instant coffee in a paper cup and sat by the window and waited for her children to wake up. Marcus woke first, the way he always did, all at once, sitting up with his eyes already open. He looked at the empty room, at his mother by the window, and processed it with the practicality of children who'd learned to reorient quickly. Is today the moving day? Part of it, yeah. Where are we going? Nora had been working on this answer for 2 weeks. She'd found the version that was true without being frightening, or as close to that version as she could get. We're going to try something this morning. Then we figure out the rest. Marcus accepted this. He found his shoes, which had somehow gotten inside his sleeping bag. He looked at Lily, who was still asleep, and then at the stuffed bear, and then at his mother with the particular look children wore when they were deciding whether to ask the real question. Is it going to be okay? Nora looked at her son. 8 years old, brown eyes, Daniel's nose, a small scar on his chin from a bicycle fall 2 summers ago. She didn't lie to her children, hadn't since the diagnosis, had made herself stop and speak carefully because children who were lied to learned to stop believing, and believing was something they would need for a long time. I don't know yet, but we're going to keep trying until it is. He nodded, tucked the bear under his arm, and went to find his jacket. Lily woke while Nora was loading the last of the sleeping bags into the car. She appeared in the doorway of the building, fully dressed, hair pulled back, backpack on. She looked at the street, at the Kia, at the early light coming gray and thin from the east. Where are we going? There's an auction at the storage place on Clement Street. 7 a.m. I want to look at a unit. Lily processed this with the analytical calm she'd developed over the last 2 years, the calm that Nora both needed and worried about. How much does it cost to bid? $5. I have 47. Lily looked at her mother for a moment, something passing across her face that Nora couldn't entirely read. Then she nodded, picked up the smaller of the duffel bags that hadn't fit in the back, and helped wedge it into the footwell of the rear seat. They drove 3 blocks in silence that was less a silence and more the absence of things there was nothing useful to say. The streets were empty except for a delivery truck making its first stops, and a man walking a dog who looked at the Kia with the mild curiosity of someone whose morning was proceeding as planned. The Red River storage lot held 5 vehicles when Nora pulled in. 3 trucks with the practical anonymity of regulars who did this for income. 1 newer SUV, and an older Camry with a woman inside writing something by the light of her phone. The auctioneer stood near the front office, a man in his 50s with the bearing of someone who'd done this often enough to have removed all ceremony from it. He had a clipboard, a jacket that said Property Works Auctions on the back, and a coffee he was still working through. Nora gave him $5. He wrote her name down without looking at it. How many units today? She asked. 14 on the list. Yours is the last one we'll get to. He meant unit 14. She'd assumed that, but hearing it confirmed something about the order of things. The other 13 units would already have been worked through by the time they reached hers. The experienced bidders with the trucks would have already found what they came for. Hers would be what was left when everything else had been claimed. She bought Marcus a granola bar from the vending machine by the office and stood with her children watching the auction move through the other units. She'd expected something theatrical. The reality was quieter. The auctioneer opened each unit. The bidders looked in for 30 seconds. Bids were placed or not placed, and the whole thing moved to the next unit with the efficiency of a process that had been performed so many times it no longer required enthusiasm. She tried to understand what the experienced bidders were reading in each unit. They moved to the front quickly, swept their eyes in a pattern that suggested specific things: brand names on boxes, shapes under tarps, the size and type of furniture. They bid on units with electronics, on units with workshop tools, on units with what appeared to be restaurant equipment. They passed quickly on units with old furniture, boxes with no markings, personal items without obvious resale value. She watched one of the experienced men, a heavy-set guy in his 60s with a gray beard and steel-toed boots, assess a unit in about 15 seconds and walk away shaking his head. She tried to see what he'd seen. Cardboard boxes, taped, no labels she could read from her distance. A vacuum cleaner. What might have been a sewing machine under a sheet. She didn't know enough to know what he knew. That was the whole of it. The people who made money at these auctions had a vocabulary she didn't have, built from years of going to estate sales and pawn shops, and knowing what things sold for and what things sat. She had $5 and a Daniel who used to point at frames and talk about arguments. The young couple in the SUV bid on 3 units and won 2. They seemed pleased with themselves, taking photos, talking to each other in low voices. They left before the last 3 units were reached. The woman in the Camry never bid. She wrote in her notebook through all 13 units, and then put the notebook in her bag and walked toward the back of the facility, where Unit 14 was. Nora followed. The unit was at the end of the back row, the farthest from the entrance and from the overhead lights. It was a standard 10 by 10, the kind they used for overspill from apartments or houses too small to hold what people accumulated. The door was down, the padlock hanging. When the auctioneer unlocked it and rolled it up, the smell came out first, cedar, and something sweet she couldn't immediately place, and underneath both, the smell of paper that had been closed with itself for a long time. She stepped forward. The unit was full in the way that suggested accumulation rather than planned storage. Not the orderly stacking of someone who'd intended to retrieve things, but the layered density of objects put in at different times, oldest at the back, most recent near the door. Cardboard boxes, some wooden crates, marked with a system that was partially legible. Room 3, Studio 2, materials. A rocking chair near the front, one leg wrapped in bubble wrap as though the owner had worried specifically about that leg. Against the left wall, 6 or 7 frames of varying sizes, each wrapped in brown paper and craft paper tape, bound with twine. Against the right wall, 2 filing cabinets, the standard 4-drawer kind. The 2 experienced bidders looked in for 20 seconds and walked away. She heard one of them say something about paper. The other one said yes. Then they were gone, back to their trucks, already calculating what they'd won that morning. The woman with the notebook stood beside Nora, looking in. She was perhaps 70, gray-haired, wearing a coat that fit well and shoes built for walking. She looked at the unit with the focused attention of someone who was not deciding whether to bid, but searching for something specific. "You bidding?" Nora asked. The woman shook her head slowly. "I was hoping to, but it's not what I expected." She said it carefully, like someone choosing not to say more than that. The auctioneer looked between them. "Any bids on Unit 14? Nora looked at the frames along the left wall. She thought about Daniel's art books, the way he talked about frames as containers for things that hadn't yet been seen by the right person. She thought about the $47. She thought about the cedar smell, which she associated with things being protected deliberately, not by accident. $5, she said. The auctioneer wrote it down. "Any other bids?" "Nothing." "Sold. Miss Callahan. Unit 14. He handed her the padlock key, told her she had 48 hours to clear the unit per the auction terms, and walked back toward the front office. The woman with the notebook was still there. She looked at Nora with an expression that was hard to read, something between assessment and something else she didn't name. "Did you know her?" Nora asked. "The person who owned this." The woman hesitated. "I knew of her. Eleanor Marsh. She was an art dealer. Worked out of Chicago, then here, for about 30 years. A pause. "She died 2 years ago. I'd been looking for her estate for a separate reason, and I saw the auction notice. I expected something different." She looked at the unit once more, then at Nora. "Be careful with the frames. Whatever they are." She left before Nora could ask what she meant. Marcus appeared at her elbow. "Is it ours?" "For 48 hours at least." He looked inside with the assessment of someone who took ownership seriously. "That chair has a broken leg. The bubble wrap is on the wrong leg. The wrapped one is fine." He considered this. Smart. Lily was standing at the door of the unit, hands in her jacket pockets, looking at the frames against the left wall. "What's in those?" "I don't know. The smell is nice." It was. The cedar came from what turned out to be a cedar-lined blanket chest near the back, and the sweet smell was harder to place. Not food, not perfume. Something organic that had been stored a long time. Something that reminded her of old wood and dried flowers in rooms that had been closed gently rather than abandoned. Nora looked at her phone. 7:38 a.m. The marshal was coming at 9. She had an hour and 20 minutes. Okay, she said to her children. Let's start looking. She went to the frames first, because the woman with the notebook had said to be careful with them. There were 7. 2 were large, perhaps 3 feet by 2, and felt substantial through the wrapping. 4 were medium-sized. 1 was small, no bigger than a book. She checked the wrapping on each. The tape was old but intact. The craft paper had yellowed but held. Someone had wrapped these with intention. Tightly, deliberately, the corners folded with the care of someone who expected the work to wait. She didn't unwrap them yet. The auction terms gave her 48 hours. She didn't need to understand everything immediately. She moved to the filing cabinets. The first drawer held hanging folders, labeled with a system she didn't immediately parse. Dates, then codes that looked like initials, then brief descriptions. March 1987, WK, watercolor study. June 1992, AR, oil on canvas, unframed. The folders contained papers, handwritten receipts, photocopies of what might have been certificates. She pulled one folder and opened it. Inside was a handwritten note on letterhead that read Marsh Fine Art, with an address on North Michigan Avenue, and below it, in neat cursive, acquired directly from artist, Provenance clean, condition excellent. Below that, a price that stopped her breathing for a moment. She told herself she was misreading the comma placement. She put the folder back. She didn't pull another. She stood in the unit, between the boxes and the frames and the cabinets, and thought about what the woman had said. Art dealer. Chicago. 30 years. Marcus was at the wooden crates near the back, reading the labels with the seriousness of a child given responsibility. Lily had moved to the cedar chest and was looking at it without touching it. The way she approached things she found interesting but wasn't sure she was allowed to handle. Mom. Lily's voice came quiet. The voice she used when she was controlling something. Nora turned. Lily was holding something she'd found tucked behind the cedar chest, between it and the back wall. A flat envelope, 9 by 12, sealed, and on the front of it, in the same neat cursive Nora had seen in the folder, a single line. To whoever needs this. It was the same handwriting. Eleanor Marsh's. Nora took it carefully. She turned it over. The seal was intact, a closure strip still holding after what must have been 2 years. The paper had yellowed slightly at the corners, but the seal had held, as though the person who sealed it had done, so knowing it might wait a while. She didn't open it there. Not with the clock running and the marshal coming and her children watching with the careful attention of people who'd learned that envelopes could contain either rescue or ruin. She put it in her bag, in the interior pocket against her ribs, where she kept things that mattered. She checked her phone. 8:04 a.m. We need to go. I have to be at the apartment. What about the stuff? Marcus asked. It stays here until I figure out what to do with it. We have 48 hours. They locked the unit. Nora put the key in her pocket beside the phone and the envelope, and they drove back to the apartment. The marshal arrived at 8:51. He was polite in the way people were polite when a job required them to be present for someone's worst days. He asked if they were ready, and Nora said yes, and he handed her the formal document that completed the eviction, and she signed it without reading it because she'd read it twice already when the notice came and knew what it said. He looked at the Kia loaded with her family's remaining life and said he hoped things got better, and she believed he meant it, and she thanked him. She drove away from the building without looking back. Marcus watched it through the rear window until it was out of sight, then turned around and pressed his face against the stuffed bear. Lily was in the front seat. She'd stopped asking where they were going and started asking what they needed, which was a shift Nora had noticed and appreciated. What did they need? It was a better question than most. Let me find somewhere to park. I need to read something. She pulled into the lot of a chain coffee shop on Porter Street, one of the ones with the big windows where people sat with laptops and no one looked twice at a car parked in their lot. She left the car running for the heat. Marcus fell asleep within minutes, the way he did when he was processing things too large to stay awake for. Lily sat with her hands in her lap, waiting. Nora took the envelope from her bag. She opened it carefully, running her finger under the seal to preserve the flap. Inside were 4 pages, handwritten, the same neat cursive. A letter, dated March 12, 2021. She read. The letter began without preamble, no formal greeting, no dear someone. Just the writing, beginning mid-thought the way people did when they'd been composing in their heads for a long time before putting pen to paper. I've been trying to write this for 3 years and keep stopping because I don't know who I'm writing to, which turns out to be a hard problem. It's easier not knowing. I've decided to write as though you need it, whoever you are, because otherwise I'll keep stopping, and I have reasons to finish this before I stop permanently. My name is Eleanor Marsh. I am 61 years old, and I have been told I have perhaps 6 months, which I've been told twice before and outlasted twice, so perhaps we'll see. I am a dealer in art, which means I have spent 30 years acquiring and selling works, some of which turned out to be significant, and some of which turned out to be worth less than I paid for them. And that is the nature of the business, and I have no complaints about it. I have put things in a storage unit. Not because I planned to, but because I ran out of time to do what I planned, and the storage unit was what I had available when my health made the office and the gallery impossible to maintain. I could not sell everything in time. I could not give everything to institutions in time. What is in that unit is what remained when my time for dealing ran out. I want to tell you something about them. Nora stopped reading. Her hands were still on the pages. The coffee shop was filling up around them with normal people in normal coats getting normal coffee, and she was sitting in a car in their parking lot reading a letter from a dead woman she'd never met. She looked at Lily. Lily was watching her, trying to read her face. It's from the woman who owned the unit, Nora said. She left a letter. Lily said nothing for a moment. Then, what does it say? She was an art dealer. She says she put things in the unit because she ran out of time to deal with them. Nora looked back at the pages. She says she wants to tell me something about them. About the frames? Nora thought about the frames against the left wall, about the woman with the notebook who'd said be careful with those, about the handwritten receipts with the prices that had briefly stopped her breathing. I think so. Should we go back? Nora looked at Marcus, asleep with his chin on the stuffed bear. She looked at the $43 remaining in her account. She looked at the envelope in her hands, at the careful cursive of a woman who'd written this knowing she might not be around to explain it to anyone. Let me finish reading first. She continued. What I left in that unit includes several items of particular significance. I am going to describe them as clearly as I can because I have no other way of ensuring this information reaches you. Against the left wall, wrapped in brown paper with craft tape and bound with sisal twine, there are 7 works. 5 of them I acquired during the 1980s and 1990s from artists who were largely unknown at the time and who, in some cases, remained unknown, and in some cases did not. Among those 5, 2 are by an artist named Thomas Bellings, who signed his work with an initial only until 1994 and then stopped signing altogether. I acquired his work early, before the signatures, and the works are documented in my records. Thomas Bellings died in 2009. His estate has been valued at considerable amount. A single identified painting sold at Christie's in 2018 for $412,000. There are 2 Bellings in the unit. The other significant work is the small one, the one no bigger than a book. It is a drawing, not a painting, done in graphite and chalk on paper. I acquired it in 1991 from an estate sale in Evanston, where it was listed as unknown artist, landscape study. I believed at the time that the style was familiar, and I was right, but proving provenance for unattributed work requires time and resources I spent 18 months pursuing. The attribution I believe to be correct is documented in the file cabinet, second drawer, folder marked landscape study, attribution notes. If I am right, and I believe I am, the drawing is worth considerably more than the Bellings. I will say only that the artist whose work I believe this to be has not appeared on the market without documentation in many decades, and the documentation that exists elsewhere is contested. Mine is not contested because I was careful. I am also aware that this letter means nothing without the documentation. The documentation exists. It is in the filing cabinet. Please be careful with it. There is one more thing I want to tell you, and it is not about the art. I became an art dealer because I was poor. That is the simplest version. The longer version involves a mother who cleaned houses and a father who left early and a childhood in Cicero, Illinois, where I was told by various adults that my interests were impractical, that I should think about the future. That art was not a career, but a luxury. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. I was told this by people who were not wrong about money and were catastrophically wrong about what money was for. I have spent my adult life in rooms full of things that other people made because they had to make them. I have sold those things to people with money, and that transaction has always felt to me like translation. Something private becoming public. Something made alone in a room, traveling into the world. When I put these things in the unit, I was not hopeless about them. I was tired. There is a difference. I want whoever finds them to know that they were put there by someone who understood what they were and who believed they would be found. Be careful with the frames. I hope you need this. Eleanor Marsh. Nora sat with the letter for a long time after she finished. The handwriting on the last page was slightly less steady than on the first, as though the act of writing had taken something from the writer that she could not fully replace while writing. But the final sentence was clear, the same neat cursive as the opening. I hope you need this. She looked at the rain that had started on the windshield, slow drops making the coffee shop's warm interior look even warmer through the glass. Lily had fallen asleep against the door. Marcus was still out, breathing slow and even, the bear tucked under his arm. The car smelled like fast food wrappers from 3 days ago, and the particular worn-in smell of people living in a small space, which Nora recognized from the months at Claire's house and had thought she'd left behind. She put the letter back in the envelope, put it back in the interior pocket, where it sat against her ribs, warm from the car's heat. $412,000 for one Thomas Bellings painting. She'd read that sentence 3 times now. There were 2 Bellings in the unit, plus the drawing, which Eleanor Marsh believed to be worth more. She was not going to get ahead of herself. She'd spent 2 years not getting ahead of herself because ahead of herself was where hope lived, and hope was expensive, and she'd learned to be careful with expensive things. The letter said Eleanor Marsh believed. Believed was not certified. Believed was not Christie's. The documentation existed, but she hadn't seen it. And documentation for a contested attribution was the kind of thing that required experts and time and money she didn't have. And she was sitting in a parking lot with $43 and 2 sleeping children and 48 hours to clear a unit she'd paid $5 for. But she had the letter. She had the unit. She had the key in her pocket. She looked at her phone. 9:47 a.m. She started the car. Lily, her daughter, came awake immediately, the way she always did. We're going back to the unit. Lily looked at her mother's face. Whatever she read there, she didn't comment on it. Okay. They drove back to Red River Storage. The lot was empty now, the other bidders gone. The facility manager was inside doing paperwork and nodded when Nora walked past the window. She unlocked Unit 14. The smell came out again, cedar and sweetness and paper, the smell of things that had been waiting patiently for the right kind of attention. She stood in the doorway looking at the 7 frames wrapped in brown paper against the left wall. She thought about Eleanor Marsh in an office on North Michigan Avenue in the 1980s, acquiring paintings from artists nobody had heard of yet, filing the documentation, being careful. She thought about the woman with the notebook who'd come here this morning looking for Eleanor's estate and left when she didn't find what she'd expected. She thought, be careful with the frames. She went to the smallest one first, the one no bigger than a book. She checked the twine, checked the tape, and then, carefully, slowly, began to open it. The paper came away in sections she set aside on the concrete floor, keeping each piece intact. When the last layer was gone, she was holding a frame, dark wood, old, slightly worn at the corners, no glass. Behind the frame, protected by a thin paper backing, was the work itself, a drawing on paper, graphite and chalk, as Eleanor had written. The paper had aged to cream, and the graphite had not faded. The image was of a landscape, hills receding into the distance, a body of water in the middle ground that might have been a river or a lake or the edge of something larger, and in the foreground a single tree rendered with a specificity that made it look less like a tree in a drawing and more like a tree being remembered by someone who had stood in front of it a long time ago and never stopped thinking about it. The chalk was used in 3 or 4 places, suggesting light rather than depicting it, which was a distinction she understood from standing beside Daniel while he worked and listening to him think out loud about the difference. She had never taken an art class and did not need one to know that this was precise. This was not a preliminary thing. It was finished, complete, wholly itself. She turned it over. On the backing paper, in pencil, 2 things. A date, 1931. Below it, initials pressed hard enough to have slightly indented the paper, E.H. She stared at the initials for a long time. Then she put the drawing down carefully against the wall and went to the filing cabinet. Second drawer, folder marked Landscape Study, Attribution Notes. She found it, pulled it out, opened it on top of the cedar chest. Inside was a document, typed, 17 pages, dense with footnotes and citations. At the top, Attribution Analysis, Graphite and Chalk Landscape Study, acquired 1991, collection E. Marsh. Prepared by Dr. Robert Kessler, Art Historical Analysis, University of Illinois at Chicago. Date, February 2003. Below the title and the author, the subject line. She read it twice, slowly, because the first time she told herself she might be misreading the proper noun, that it might be a name she was confusing with another name. The second time she read it more slowly still, checking each word, and she was not misreading it. Her hands began to shake. She set the document on the cedar chest and stepped back from it. One step, then another, until her back was against the opposite wall of the unit. She stood there and looked at it from that distance, and it said the same thing from there that it said up close. Dr. Robert Kessler had spent 18 months in 2001 and 2002 examining the drawing Eleanor Marsh had pulled from an estate sale box in Evanston a decade earlier. He had examined the paper under spectrographic analysis. He had compared the graphite composition against known samples. He had consulted the date, 1931, the initials, E. H. The particular quality of the tree in the foreground, which Kessler spent 3 pages describing in terms Nora could only partly follow, but the conclusion of which she could follow completely. He had traced the provenance of the Evanston estate, the collector who had assembled it, the gallery that collector had purchased from, and then further back, to a private sale in New York in 1944, and further back still, to a transaction in Paris in 1937 in which a painting, not a drawing, a painting, by the same hand had changed hands for a price that had seemed unremarkable at the time. The subject line of the document read, Attribution Analysis, E. H. Works, Landscape Study, Collection E. Marsh. Probable author, Edward Hopper. Confidence, high. She had read that subject line 4 times now. Each time it said the same thing. Outside, she could hear Marcus asking Lily about the rocking chair, whether they could keep it, whether it would fit in the Kia. She could hear Lily saying, I don't know yet. Let's ask Mom. She could hear the distant sound of the street doing what streets did, oblivious and ongoing. The ordinary Tuesday morning of a city that had no way of knowing what had just shifted inside a storage unit at the back of a lot on Clement Street. She pressed her palms flat against the cedar chest, the way Marcus pressed his hands against the floor when things were too large to hold on to otherwise. Breathed. She thought about the $47 she'd woken up with. She thought about the marshal's document in her bag and the Kia in the parking lot with the duffel bags and the 4 cardboard boxes, everything she and her children had left. She thought about Lily saying fine in the voice that meant not fine at all, and Marcus asking if it was going to be okay, and herself answering honestly that she didn't know. She thought about Daniel spending Saturday mornings in a garage, annotating books about artists who'd made things that outlasted them. She thought about frames as arguments for taking something seriously. She thought about Eleanor Marsh in an office on North Michigan Avenue in the 1980s. being careful for 30 years, spending 18 months having a drawing analyzed, building a file that sat in a cabinet for 2 decades waiting for someone to need it. She thought about the woman with the notebook who'd driven to this auction and left without bidding because it wasn't what she expected. She thought about what the woman might have been expecting, whether she'd known the attribution existed, whether she'd been looking for exactly this. She thought about the cedar chest still locked and the 6 frames still wrapped and the 16 folders she hadn't read yet. She thought, 48 hours. 48 hours and $43 and a 17-page document on a cedar chest. Then she called her children in. Come look at this. Tell me I'm reading it right. Lily came to her shoulder and read the document's first page. She read it with the slow, careful attention she brought to things that mattered, the attention that had always been there and had sharpened considerably over the last 2 years. She read the title, the author's name, the date. Then she read the subject line. Nora watched her daughter's eyes move through it twice, the same way her own had. Then Lily looked at her mother, and she looked at the drawing leaning against the wall, and she looked back at her mother. The drawing of the tree and the hills and the body of water, with the chalk used sparingly in 3 or 4 places, suggesting light the way someone suggested it, who understood that the goal was not to show the light, but to make the person looking feel it had been there. Mom, I know. Is this real? Nora thought about the letter in her pocket, about I hope you need this, about Eleanor Marsh in a gallery in 1991, pulling a drawing from a box at an estate sale in Evanston because the style was familiar. She thought about careful, about 30 years of being careful, about a filing cabinet full of documentation that had survived 2 years of storage and an auction that nobody else had bid on. She thought about the woman with the notebook who'd come looking for Eleanor's estate and left when she didn't find what she'd expected, and she thought about what the woman might have been expecting to find, and whether the woman had known. I think so, Nora said. I don't know yet, but I think so. Marcus was looking at the drawing with his head tilted at the angle he used when he was trying to understand something. He looked at it for a long time, longer than he usually looked at things, in the way children sometimes stop to fully see something they sensed was important even if they couldn't say why. It's pretty, he said finally. It looks like somewhere real, like a place someone actually went and then spent a long time remembering. Yeah, Nora said. I think it does. She stood in the unit with the document in her hands and the drawing against the wall and her children beside her and $43 in her bank account and the slow, specific understanding that something had shifted, that the arithmetic she'd been doing for 18 months was about to change in a way she couldn't fully see yet, but could feel the way you felt weather arriving. Not from anything you could point to. From the pressure of the air itself, from the way the light through the unit's single overhead fixture fell differently on the things around her than it had 10 minutes ago, from the knowledge sitting in her chest like something finally exhaled after being held too long. She needed to make some calls. She needed to find someone who knew what she was holding. Someone with credentials, with access to the right verification channels. Someone who could look at 17 pages of analysis from a University of Illinois professor and tell her whether the words confidence high meant what she thought they meant in practical terms, monetary terms, terms that might change what the next 48 hours looked like and the weeks after that. She needed to be careful, the way Eleanor Marsh had been careful, because careful was what had preserved these things across 2 years of storage and a death and an unclaimed unit and an auction where no one else bid. She needed to not fall apart before she understood the full shape of what she had. That was the rule. Eleanor Marsh had not fallen apart. She had been careful for 30 years. Nora could be careful for 48 hours. The filing cabinet still had 16 more folders she hadn't looked at yet. The cedar chest was still locked. She hadn't found the key yet. 6 frames remained against the left wall, still wrapped, still bound with sisal twine that had held for 2 years and would hold until she was ready. Outside, the rain continued, steady and indifferent, tapping against the metal roof of the storage facility in the particular way that said it had no plans to stop soon. Marcus asked if they could eat something. Lily said she'd check what was left in the bag. The city moved around them, unknowing and entirely unaware that a woman with $43 and a padlock key and a letter from a dead stranger was standing in a storage unit at the back of a parking lot on Clement Street, holding a 17-page attribution document with shaking hands, reading a subject line she had now read 4 times, and was beginning, slowly and carefully, to believe. She reached for the second frame. It was heavier than the first one. The second frame was 2 feet wide and perhaps 3 feet tall. When she got the paper off, what she found was a painting on canvas, oil. The canvas stretched over a wooden frame that someone had built with the same attention given to the stretcher bars in art supply catalogs. Each corner tight and square even after years in storage. The painting showed a street scene. Dusk, or the particular hour just past it, when artificial light had taken over from what the sky was still offering. 2 figures in the foreground, indistinct, caught mid-stride. A shop window behind them with a glow that fell sideways onto the wet pavement. The whole thing rendered in a palette of grays and ochres and one deliberate note of deep red in the shop's sign, which was not legible as text but readable as the idea of a sign, the way a shorthand note could stand for a full sentence if the person reading it already knew the language. Nora looked at it for a long time. She did not know if it was beautiful in any technical sense. She knew that it made her feel that the street in the painting was a real street, that the 2 figures had somewhere to be, that the shop with the glowing window was still there even though she couldn't find it on a map. It had the quality Daniel talked about, the difference between correct and true. She turned it over. On the back of the canvas stretcher, in pencil, a small mark, a single initial. T. Below it, a year, 1988. Nothing else. She looked at the first folder she'd pulled earlier, the one from the filing cabinet's top drawer. March 1987, WK, watercolor study. This was different. Oil, later date, different initial. She went back to the cabinet, pulled the folder marked June 1992, AR. Then she pulled the one next to it. Then the one after that, working quickly now, reading labels, cross-referencing them in her head. The folders were organized by acquisition date, and each one had the initial of the artist in the code. She found the folder for 1988. The tab read, September 1988, TB, oil on canvas, street scene. Unsigned front. She opened it. Inside were 3 pages. A receipt, handwritten, from a gallery on Superior Street in Chicago that she suspected no longer existed. A description in Eleanor's cursive, street scene, 2 figures, dusk light, deep red accent, and signed, acquired from the artist directly following introduction through Robert Shin. Below the description, 2 lines, TB equals Thomas Bellings. Document Provenance conversation. File supporting materials. She looked at the painting. She looked at the folder. She looked back at the painting. Thomas Bellings. One painting at Christie's in 2018 for $412,000. This was not that painting. But Eleanor had said there were 2 in the unit. She went to the 3rd frame. It was the largest of the 7, nearly 4 feet across. The wrapping on this one was older than the others. The craft paper browned further at the edges. The tape crystallized in the way tape got after 2 decades rather than 2 years. Eleanor had wrapped this one long before the others. She'd owned it longer. The painting inside was a landscape. Fields, open and wide under a sky that occupied more than half the canvas. A sky that was not simply blue, but a kind of argument about what blue could hold. Gray in it, and green in it, and a quality of late afternoon that made Nora feel she was standing in a field she'd never been to at a time of day she'd never quite caught. In the far lower right corner, barely visible unless you were looking for it, a mark, not a full signature, an initial, T, and a year, 1991. She went back to the filing cabinet, found the folder. TB, oil on canvas, 1991, landscape, large format. Signed front lower right with initial only. Acquired directly from artist. Document. Bill of sale, handwritten, signed by artist, notarized. The bill of sale was in the folder. She unfolded it. Thomas Bellings, at an address on the north side, had sold this painting to Eleanor Marsh on October 14, 1991, for $400. He'd signed it. The notary stamp was legible, dated the same day. $400 in 1991. She didn't know what it might be worth now. She knew what one Bellings had sold for in 2018. She knew the word comparable meant different things to different people in different rooms, but in rooms where paintings sold at Christie's, comparable was not a small word. She set the folder on the cedar chest with the attribution document and stood back from both of them and looked at her 2 children. Marcus was sitting on the floor near the rocking chair, eating the last of the granola bar, watching her work with the patience of someone who had learned that his mother did not need commentary when she was thinking. Lily was standing near the door, arms folded the way she did when she was containing something, watching Nora's face for information. There are at least 2 significant paintings, Nora said. Possibly more. I need to open the other 4 frames. Lily unfolded her arms. Then opened them. She opened 2 more that afternoon. Both were medium-sized works, both oil on canvas, both by artists whose folder labels read like names she'd never encountered. One initials MS, one initials DK. She didn't know them, couldn't place them, couldn't say from looking at the paintings whether they were worth anything or nothing. One was a figure study, a woman seated at a table with her face turned away. The other was abstract, geometric shapes in a color palette that felt like the early 80s. Both were documented in their folders. Both had been acquired from artists directly. Neither had the same length of documentation as the Bellings or the Hopper analysis. The last 2 frames she set aside unopened. She was running out of time and beginning to understand she needed to make decisions before she understood everything, which was not how she preferred to operate, but was frequently how things required operating. She looked at her phone. 1:24 p.m. She'd been in the unit for nearly 6 hours. The marshal had come and gone. They had no apartment. They had a locked cedar chest and 7 paintings and a 17-page attribution document, and the question of what 48 hours actually meant when the clock had already been running since 7 that morning. We need to figure out tonight, she said. Marcus looked up from the floor. Are we sleeping here? Lily said nothing, waiting. Nora did the math she'd been avoiding. $43. The Salvation Army shelter on Dewberry required a photo ID and proof of local address, which she no longer had in the form they wanted. The motels within walking distance of this facility were not the expensive kind, but even the cheapest she'd seen was $59 a night. She could put it on the credit card that was in collections, which would either work or not work, and if it didn't work, she'd be standing at a front desk explaining that to 2 children in the rain. Not here, she said. There's a shelter on Dewberry. We'll go tonight. Lily's expression didn't change. Marcus nodded. But first I need to make some calls from in here. Can you 2 find somewhere to sit for a little while longer? Marcus moved to the rocking chair, which held his weight without complaint. Lily sat on a wooden crate near the door. Nora pulled up her phone and started searching. The University of Illinois at Chicago still existed. Dr. Robert Kessler, the author of the attribution document, had retired in 2016 according to the department's faculty emeritus page, which listed a contact email that was probably not checked often. She sent a message anyway, knowing it might reach no one, explaining briefly that she had acquired the collection of Eleanor Marsh through a storage auction, that she had found his attribution analysis, that she wanted to verify the current status of the work and ask if he could recommend someone with whom she could speak. She didn't mention the drawing by name in the email. Careful. Then she searched for art appraisers. Chicago had several, and several had websites with the practiced language of authority, certified, international, fine art. She called 3 numbers. 2 went to voicemail. The 3rd reached a woman named Patricia who said she could book Nora in for an appointment the following Thursday, which was 10 days away, which was useless when she had 29 hours remaining on the unit. She explained the situation. She had the unit for 48 hours. She had found significant work. She needed someone to look. There was a pause on the other end. Then, what kind of work? Nora thought about careful. 2 oils, I believe, are by a known artist. 1 drawing with an existing attribution analysis. I can send photos. Another pause. Send them. I'll look this afternoon. She photographed the paintings and the drawing and the cover page of the attribution document, not the full text, just the subject line and the author. She sent them to the email the appraiser provided. Then she sat on an upturned crate and looked at the cedar chest. It was old, the cedar chest. Older than the paintings, older maybe than Eleanor's career. The kind of thing passed down rather than purchased, with the rounded corners and brass hardware of furniture built before planned obsolescence. It was locked with a small padlock, tarnished but intact. She'd looked for a key in the top drawer of the filing cabinet and found nothing. She'd checked the pockets and surfaces of the unit without success. Mom. Lily, from the door. Is that her? The woman from this morning? Nora looked up. Through the gap of the unit's open door, across the parking lot, a car had pulled in. The older Camry. The woman with the notebook was getting out. She walked directly toward the back row where Unit 14 sat. She moved with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where she was going and had decided something since the morning. When she reached the unit, she stopped, looked at the paintings Nora had leaned against the far wall, and stood very still. "You opened the frames," she said. "It's my unit." The woman looked at the Bellings landscape. She looked at it the way the experienced bidders had looked at units that morning, with the practiced sweep of someone reading information rather than aesthetics. Then she looked at Nora with an expression that had shifted from the morning's careful neutrality into something more direct. "My name is Patricia Helms. I own a gallery in River North. I had a professional relationship with Eleanor Marsh for 11 years. She paused. I knew she had a Kessler analysis. I didn't know what it was for, specifically. She was careful about that kind of information. But I suspected the collection was more significant than her estate indicated, and when I saw the auction notice I came to look. And you didn't bid." Patricia Helms looked at the document on the cedar chest. The subject line was visible from where she stood. Her face was still but not unreadable, and what it read was controlled recognition. She looked back at Nora. "I was expecting the unit to have already been claimed by the estate or by a legal representative. When it hadn't been, when it was open to public auction for a $5 entry bid, I wasn't prepared to believe the significant work was still in it." A beat. I underestimated Eleanor. She always did things her own way. "What do you want?" Patricia Helms looked at her directly. "To help you. Or to be honest, to help myself in a way that also helps you, because one requires the other." She glanced at Marcus in the rocking chair and Lily by the door and the two duffel bags visible in the back of the Kia through the open parking lot. "You need an expert. I am one. I have contacts at 3 auction houses and access to verification resources that would take you weeks to find on your own. And you have," she paused, "what Eleanor Marsh spent 30 years building." Nora looked at her. "And what do you get?" 15% of sale value on anything I authenticate and broker. Standard industry rate. Eleanor paid me the same. You can verify that. You could just take photos and use your contacts without me. Photos aren't enough for work of this significance. I need to handle the pieces, examine them, coordinate a chain of custody document from the auction purchase through to sale. You're in that chain. I need your cooperation." She met Nora's eyes. I also knew Eleanor, and Eleanor would not have wanted someone to walk in here and rout around the person who found it. Nora thought for a moment. She thought about careful. She thought about the difference between having something significant and being able to prove it, move it, sell it through channels that didn't end in disputes or claims or legal processes that ate the value while they ran. "I want everything in writing before you touch a single thing." Patricia Helms nodded immediately, as though she'd expected that. "I have a standard agreement in my bag. We can modify it here." She did have a standard agreement. 6 pages, single-spaced, with the slightly dense language of a document that had been written by someone who knew what could go wrong and had tried to anticipate most of it. Nora read every word. Lily, standing at her shoulder, read it too, and asked 2 questions that Nora hadn't thought to ask, about the termination clause and about whether the percentage applied to gross sale or net. Patricia Helms answered both without hesitation, made one small amendment by hand in the margin, and both she and Nora initialed it. "Marcus," from the rocking chair. "Is she the person who decides if it's real?" Patricia Helms turned to look at him. "One of them. There are usually several." "How many do you need? For something significant?" "At least 3 independent experts who don't know each other's opinions before they give their own." Marcus considered this. Like a science experiment. "Controls." Patricia Helms looked at him with something that might have been surprise. "Exactly like that." She spent the next hour and a half in the unit, working methodically. She handled each painting with cotton gloves she produced from her bag. She examined the stretcher bars, the canvas edges, the back surfaces. She photographed everything, front and back, full frame and detail, the marks and initials, and the single instance where Thomas Bellings had signed his name in full on the bill of sale that sat in Eleanor's folder. She read the Kessler document in full, standing at the cedar chest, page by page, not rushing it. When she finished, she set the document down and stood for a moment without speaking. "The Kessler analysis is thorough," she said. "He was careful. The spectral data he references from 2001 aligns with known Hopper work from the early 1930s. The paper, composition, the graphite formulation. He had access to resources that weren't widely available at the time. which means the analysis was expensive to commission and Eleanor considered it worth the expense. But there is always a but with unattributed work. The but in this case is that Kessler died in 2018 and can't be deposed. His methodology was sound, but sound methodology and provable attribution are different things when the artist in question has an estate with an active catalog raisonné committee. She paused. That committee has rejected attributions before. Some they were right to reject, some they were not. You're telling me it might not hold. I'm telling you it needs to go to independent analysis before it goes anywhere else. We need someone from the committee itself, or someone with enough standing that the committee can't easily dismiss the assessment. She looked at Nora. I know a woman at the Whitney who owes me a significant favor. If I call in that favor, she'll look at this within the week. Nora thought about the 48-hour clock. I have until tomorrow morning to clear the unit. I know. I'll bring my van. We can move everything to my gallery storage tonight, which is climate-controlled and insured, and you'll have a chain of custody document from the storage facility auction through to my gallery within 2 hours of transfer. Nora looked at her children. Marcus was watching the conversation with the focused attention he brought to things that would affect their lives. Lily was looking at the paintings, at the Bellings landscape specifically, with the same forward lean she'd gotten from Daniel. Mom, Lily said, still looking at the landscape. The way the sky is painted. It's the same kind of thing Dad used to talk about. Nora looked at the painting. Lily turned toward her. Dad used to say there was a difference between a painter who wanted to show you something and one who wanted you to feel something. This one. She gestured at the landscape. This one wanted you to feel it. Patricia Helms looked at Lily, then at Nora. Something in her expression shifted slightly, softened by a fraction. Your daughter has good instincts. Her father was a painter. Patricia Helms said nothing more about it. She went back to her work, photographing the 2 remaining unopened frames before she opened them herself. The first held an oil painting Nora hadn't expected, a portrait, a young woman looking slightly left of center, rendered with a loose precision that managed to be both fast and careful. The second held a smaller oil, an interior scene, a table with light on it and nothing else, which somehow read as more private than the portrait and more finished than the landscape. Neither had legible signatures. Both had folder documentation. Neither was in the same category as the Bellings or the drawing. These 2 are competent, Patricia Helms said. They'll sell. I wouldn't expect significant numbers, but they're genuine period works with documentation. 5 to 15,000 each, depending on the room. Nora heard the numbers and set them in a separate part of her mind to be dealt with later. Beside the larger numbers, she wasn't letting herself fully calculate yet. What about the cedar chest? She said. Patricia Helms looked at it. Do you have the key? Not yet. Lily had been quietly working her way through the unit while the adults talked. She'd opened every cardboard box that wasn't sealed with heavy tape, working systematically from the front toward the back. She hadn't said anything about what she found because she'd understood, without being told, that saying things required certainty, and she was only gathering. Now she crossed to where they were standing and opened her hand. A small key, brass, tarnished, on a ring with a faded tag that read in Eleanor's cursive, the same script from the letter, chest. It was in the bottom of the box marked room 3, Lily said, under a layer of tissue paper, like she expected someone to look for it. Nora took the key. She looked at her daughter for a moment. Like she planned the whole thing, Nora said quietly. Yeah, Lily said. That's what I thought too. The chest opened without resistance. The lid was heavy, lined in cedar that released a fresh burst of the smell that had been in the unit since morning, sharper now, the smell of the chest itself rather than the room it sat in. Inside were 3 distinct categories of things, each separated by cloth dividers that had been placed deliberately, not thrown in. The first category was paper, folders, notebooks, envelopes, a leather journal. The folders held documents similar to what was in the filing cabinet, but older. Earlier in Eleanor's career, acquisition records from the late 1970s and early 1980s, artists she'd worked with before she had a North Michigan Avenue address and a gallery letterhead. The envelopes held correspondence, some handwritten, some typed. On the outside of several envelopes, in Eleanor's hand, names, Thomas B., Robert K., and one that read simply Whitney. The second category was smaller works, 3 drawings, each folded into individual glassine envelopes. They were smaller than the Hopper-attributed piece, quick studies rather than finished works, but they were documented in a small notebook laid on top of them. 3 purchases from 3 artists in the 1970s, early acquisitions, Eleanor's first years as a dealer. The notebook's handwriting was younger than the letter's cursive, less settled, the pen moving with the speed of someone still finding their pace. The third category was a single item at the bottom of the chest, wrapped not in paper, but in a length of dark blue velvet. Nora lifted it carefully. It was a frame, small, smaller than anything else she'd opened today, perhaps 8 inches by 6. She unwrapped it. Inside was a photograph, black and white, printed on heavy paper, the kind of print that came from a darkroom, rather than a machine. It showed 2 women standing in what appeared to be a gallery, based on the white walls and the visible corner of a frame at the edge of the image. One of the women was young, perhaps late 20s, with the particular composure of someone who was confident in the space she was standing in. The other woman was older, perhaps 50, and was looking at something outside the frame of the photograph with an expression that suggested she was in the middle of explaining something that mattered. On the back of the photograph, in the younger handwriting from the Cedar chest notebook, Eleanor and Mrs. Hall, first show, November 1979. We sold 2. Below that, in the same hand, a different pen, added later by the spacing and color of the ink. She taught me everything about looking. Nora held the photograph for a moment. She thought about, I hope you need this. She thought about a woman who had spent 30 years being careful, building files, paying for analyses, documenting everything, and who had at some point looked at this photograph of herself and the woman who'd taught her and added a note she'd never shown anyone, just kept it in a velvet-wrapped frame at the bottom of a cedar chest. She put the photograph back gently. Patricia Helms was looking at the correspondence envelopes. She picked up the one marked Whitney, looked at it, didn't open it. She looked at Nora. May I? Nora nodded. Inside were 3 letters, typed, from a museum address in New York. Nora couldn't read them from where she was standing, but she watched Patricia Helms's face as she read. The controlled expression held, but something behind it moved, something that had been speculation becoming something closer to certainty. She submitted the Kessler analysis to the Catalog Raisonné Committee in 2004, Patricia Helms said. They deferred. Not rejected, deferred, pending additional documentation she hadn't yet assembled. She was still building the case when she got sick. She held the letters carefully. She was going to win it. She just ran out of time. Outside, the afternoon was going gray. The rain had stopped, but left the air with the cold that came after it, the kind that got into clothes and stayed. Nora's stomach had been making a case for food for an hour. Marcus had long since finished the granola bar and was being quiet about it in the way he was quiet about things he knew they couldn't fix immediately. We need to talk about tonight, Nora said. Patricia Helms folded the letters back into the envelope. Where are you staying? The sentence landed in the unit without anywhere comfortable to land. Marcus looked at the floor. Lily looked at the paintings. Nora told the truth the way she'd gotten used to telling it. Simply, without apology, because apology required energy and energy was finite. We don't have anywhere yet. We were evicted this morning. Patricia Helms looked at her. Something passed across her face that Nora watched for judgment, because judgment had been what most faces showed her in the last 18 months, the particular expression of people who believed that circumstances were largely deserved. Patricia Helms didn't wear that expression. She wore the expression of someone recalculating. My gallery has a storage area and a back office with a couch and a full bathroom. It's not proper accommodation. We've slept in the car, Nora said. A couch and a bathroom is not a hardship. Patricia Helms looked at Marcus. He was looking back at her with his hands folded in his lap, patient in the way he'd become since Daniel died, the patience of someone who'd learned that the adults were doing their best and that doing his part meant not making it harder. All right, Patricia Helms said. I'll bring the van. We'll move everything now, before the light goes. They moved everything between 4 and 6 p.m. Patricia Helms drove a white cargo van with the gallery name on the side in clean sans serif type. Helms Fine Art, River North. She and Nora carried the paintings while Lily directed Marcus on the boxes, systematic and thorough. The cedar chest went in last, locked, the key in Nora's pocket. Patricia Helms produced the chain of custody form on a clipboard, wrote each item with a description and condition note, and had Nora sign at the bottom. She made 2 copies on her phone camera and sent them to an email she described as her archivist. The facility manager came out of the office as they were loading the last box. He was a man in his 60s who looked like he'd seen most things and kept his opinions largely to himself, which was apparently a personality trait the job required. "You cleaning it out early?" "Yes," Nora said. "All good." He shrugged, handed her the paperwork that closed out the unit, and went back inside. Simple as that. 26 months of a dead woman's work, documented for 30 years before it arrived in this unit, and then again today, loaded into a white van in 2 hours on a November afternoon. They drove to the gallery. River North was the kind of neighborhood that had made itself over several times in Nora's lifetime, the current version being galleries and restaurants, and the particular density of people with money who liked being near other people with money. Helm's Fine Art occupied a narrow storefront that went back much farther than its facade suggested, with the gallery space in front and a work area behind that smelled of paper and the faint chemical sweetness of archival materials. Patricia Helms made room in the climate-controlled storage. She laid the paintings horizontally on padded racks, the drawings in flat files, the documents in archival boxes she labeled by hand. She moved through it quickly and precisely, speaking occasionally to herself in a low voice that was not quite audible, the way people narrated internally when they were working through something complex. Nora watched her work. She watched the way Patricia Helms handled each piece, the gloved hand steady, the examination thorough. There was no performance in it. This was someone who had done this long enough that competence had become invisible, the way it did when it was real. She thought about Eleanor's journal notation, "She taught me everything about looking," and thought that looking was probably the central skill in this work, the way cutting was the central skill in surgery, the one thing everything else depended on. Nora watched her handle the Bellings landscape. Patricia Helms stood it on the padded surface and looked at it in the gallery's better light for perhaps 45 seconds, longer than she'd looked at anything else. "He painted this at the end of his most productive period," she said, "before he stopped showing. He walked away from the market entirely in 1993. Everything he made after 1991 is rare." She didn't take her eyes off the painting. Eleanor acquired this during the last year he would sell to anyone. Why did he stop? He said the selling changed the making, that he couldn't make things while people were trying to own them. He lived in Wisconsin, died alone in 2009. His estate went to a nephew who barely knew him and has been selling slowly through a specialist dealer ever since. She finally looked away from the painting. The nephew doesn't know what's in private collections, doesn't know what Eleanor had, which means the 2 pieces you own are not reflected in any current valuation of Bellings' accessible work. Nora absorbed this, meaning the specialist dealer's price data doesn't account for them, meaning when these appear on the market, the supply changes, which affects demand, which affects price. She looked at Nora steadily. "I want you to understand what I'm telling you. Not that these are worth a large number. That these are worth a large number that might change the number further once the market absorbs them." Nora stood with that for a moment. In the back room, audible through the wall, Marcus was asking Lily something about the couch dimensions. Lily was telling him to stop moving the cushions around. The ordinary small sounds of her children in a new space. She thought about the shelter on Dewberry Street, the one that separated families by gender above age 12. She thought about the 3 months on Claire's couch. She thought about the Kia in the lot outside with the duffel bags and the 4 cardboard boxes and the 3 annotated art books she'd kept because getting rid of them felt too close to letting go. She thought about Daniel in the garage on Saturdays, annotating margins, paying attention to things that other people walked past. Why didn't Eleanor sell the Bellings herself, she asked. Patricia Helms sat down on a work stool, which was the first time Nora had seen her sit down all day. She had the look of someone who'd been on her feet long enough that sitting required a decision rather than simply happening. She intended to. She'd been managing her timeline carefully, which work sold first, which she held. She held these 2 because she thought their time hadn't come yet. She was right about that. A pause. She underestimated how fast her time would come, instead. Nora thought about that. About Eleanor in 2021, writing a letter to no one in particular at the bottom of a storage unit envelope, knowing the time she'd been managing was nearly done. About the careful specificity of the letter, The way Eleanor had described each significant piece as though she'd been preparing to describe it for years and finally had permission. She cared about where it went, Nora said. The work. She could have written instructions to sell it all and distribute the proceeds. She didn't do that. Patricia Helms looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition. Something in between. No, she didn't. A pause. Eleanor had strong feelings about work and the people who ended up with it. She believed some things found the right person the same way a good teacher found the right student. Not by design, exactly, by a kind of accumulated pressure toward the right outcome. She stood up from the stool. I thought it was mysticism when she said it. I'm not sure what I think now. In the small office that connected to the storage space, there was a couch in dark green fabric and a desk and a bathroom with a shower. Patricia Helms had produced, from somewhere in the gallery's small kitchen, 3 turkey sandwiches in deli paper and a bag of chips, which she set on the desk without ceremony. Marcus looked at the food with a relief he was too polite to fully show, which meant he showed it anyway, because that was how relief worked. Thank you, he said. Patricia Helms looked at him. You're welcome. There's a clean towel in the bathroom cabinet, and the shower works fine. She left them and went back to the storage area, where Nora could hear her making quiet sounds of continued work, the careful cataloging sounds of someone who hadn't finished for the day. Nora sat on the couch with Marcus beside her and Lily across in the desk chair. They ate without talking much, which was fine. They'd gotten good at eating without talking much. It was one of the things grief and circumstance had made of them. This family of 3 that used to be 4. The ability to be together without requiring much from each other, to share a room and food and silence, and have that be enough. It wasn't always enough. But on the days it was, Nora noticed it. She considered it something she hadn't paid for and probably didn't deserve, which was the shape that gratitude took in her after 2 years of being short on almost everything else. Lily ate half her sandwich and then looked at the storage room through the open door. The Bellings landscape was visible from where she sat, the wide sky catching the lamplight. Is it going to work out? She asked. Nora looked at her daughter, 14 years old, asking the question Marcus had asked at 8 and gotten the same honest answer to. And Lily was old enough to want more than honest and get it anyway. I think so, Nora said. I actually think so this time. Lily held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the painting. After she left them to settle, Nora sat on the couch with the leather journal from the Cedar chest in her lap. She'd waited until they were alone to open it. The journal's cover was worn, the spine cracked in 2 places from being opened and closed many times over many years. The first entry was dated 1981, the handwriting the same younger version from the chest notebook. Eleanor at 21 or 22, writing in a journal the way people did when they were trying to understand something about themselves that didn't yet have a name. She didn't read it all that night. She didn't have the right to all of it yet, and she wasn't sure she ever would. But she read the first 20 pages, which covered the first year of Eleanor's career as a dealer. A woman with no money and no connections, and a trained eye she developed through years of standing in museum galleries on free days and looking until she understood what she was looking at. A woman who'd been told she had no business in that world, that she didn't have the backing or the education or the right introductions. A woman who had walked into a gallery in 1979 with 3 paintings she'd bought from artists she'd met at open studios, paintings she'd paid for with money saved from waitressing, and convinced the owner to let her represent them. We sold 2 that night, Eleanor had written. I stood in the corner trying to look like I'd expected that. I hadn't expected that. But I made myself look like I had because the 3rd painting was still on the wall, and I needed Mrs. Hall to believe I knew what I was doing. The 3rd painting sold the following week. Lily had fallen asleep sitting up, her head against the couch back. Marcus was asleep on the folded blanket Patricia Helms had left, his bear under his chin. The gallery was silent. Outside, River North was doing what it did after dark, cars and restaurants, and people whose evenings were proceeding as planned. Nora kept reading. She read until 1986, which was the year Eleanor first encountered work she described as genuinely unseen. She'd been to an estate sale in Evanston, the same Evanston from the Kessler document, and bought 3 boxes of prints and drawings for $40. Most of them were competent works by competent artists from the early 20th century. One was not. The entries from the early 1980s had a quality Nora recognized without being able to name precisely. They were the entries of someone building something under conditions that didn't guarantee it would get built. Eleanor had worked from a small apartment she called the office, which meant the dining table, until 1983, when she rented a single room in a shared building on Huron Street that she described as smelling like turpentine and other people's ambitions. She sold work on commission initially, then began buying directly from artists when she'd saved enough to make that viable, which took 2 years and meant eating cheaper lunches than she wanted to eat. She wrote about money the way people wrote about weather, as a given condition of the landscape that had to be worked around rather than resented. "I do not resent the money problem," she wrote in 1982. "The money problem is just the shape this particular work takes when you're starting. Everyone starts with the shape. The ones who quit think the shape is the problem. The ones who stay understand that the shape is just the beginning of the problem, and the real problem is more interesting." Nora looked up from the journal for a moment, at her daughter sleeping against the couch back. Lily had been 14 for 3 months. She'd been growing into a person who could read a contract clause and ask the right question about it, who could stand in a storage unit and identify what mattered without being told. Nora thought about what Eleanor had been doing at 14, wherever that had been, in Cicero, Illinois, before she'd become someone who sat in galleries and understood what she was looking at. She thought about the shape of beginnings, about the way things that became significant rarely announced themselves as such at the start. She kept reading. "I nearly didn't open the 3rd box," Eleanor wrote. "I was tired. I'd been on my feet for 8 hours. But I'd paid for it, and so I opened it, and inside, between 2 pieces of cardboard held together with twine, was a drawing. I knew the moment I held it that the drawing was something. I didn't know what yet. I wasn't certain enough to write it down. But I felt it in my hands the way you feel a difference in temperature. You can't not feel it once you've felt it. I took it home. I spent 3 evenings with Daniel's book on American realism from the gallery library." Nora stopped reading. She turned the page back, reread the sentence. Daniel's book. Not Daniel her Daniel. Not possible. The timing was wrong by 20 years. Eleanor hadn't known them. Daniel was a common name. Eleanor must have borrowed a book from a gallery library that happened to be authored by or associated with someone named Daniel. She kept reading. The book was called American Realism and the Material World, published 1978, University of Chicago Press. Author, Daniel R. Klein. She reread it 3 times over 3 evenings, paying attention to the section on the relationship between graphite ground and chalk overlay in works from the late 1920s through the mid-1930s. Then I called Dr. Kessler, whom I'd met at a conference the previous year, and I asked if he'd look at something without knowing what I thought it was. It wasn't Daniel. It was a book by a man named Daniel Klein. She sat with the coincidence for a moment, the way coincidences sometimes landed close enough to meaning to make you take them seriously even when you knew they weren't. Then she let it go. She kept reading until she found the entry she was looking for. March 2003. Eleanor's account of receiving the completed Kessler analysis. "He called me at 7 in the morning. Robert never called in the morning. I knew before he said anything. He said he was confident. He said confidence. Hi," which was his language, not mine, and which in 22 years of knowing him I had never heard him use. Robert was not a man who committed to certainty. Confidence. Hi was as close as he would come to saying I'm certain. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after we hung up. I have held this drawing for 12 years. I have looked at it perhaps 1,000 times in that span. I have wanted to be right and been afraid of being wrong in equal measure, which is the exact ratio of fear and want that constitutes this work. Now someone else agrees, and instead of feeling certain, I feel only very still. Very careful. I am going to need to be more careful than I have ever been." Nora set the journal down. She looked at the ceiling of the back office, at the light Patricia Helms had left on, a soft lamp in the corner that made the room feel less like borrowed space. She looked at her children sleeping. She looked at the cedar chest in the corner of the storage room through the open door, locked again with the key in her pocket. She thought about Eleanor Marsh sitting in her kitchen in 2003, just told that she'd been right for 12 years. Very still, very careful. She thought about herself, sitting in a parking lot at 4:42 that morning with $47 and 2 sleeping children and the arithmetic of not enough. The appraiser had not yet called back. The woman at the Whitney did not yet know this work existed. Dr. Kessler was dead, and his analysis was 17 pages in a folder that was now in Patricia Helms's climate-controlled storage. There were still 2 letters in the filing cabinet she hadn't read. The cedar chest notebook with the early drawings was still only partially examined. The full scope of what Eleanor Marsh had assembled over 30 years was not yet visible to Nora, not yet quantified, not yet confirmed by the 3 independent experts Patricia Helms had said were the standard. She had left the apartment at 6:45 that morning with $47 and no plan beyond surviving the day. She was in a gallery in River North with her children sleeping in the back office. She had a signed agreement with a woman who had 11 years of professional history with Eleanor Marsh. She had a letter that began, "I hope you need this." She had a cedar chest key in her pocket and a leather journal in her lap, and the particular feeling she associated with the edge of things, the feeling that had come before every significant shift in her life, not the change itself, but the breath before it. She did not know yet what she had. She knew it was real. She knew Eleanor Marsh had been careful for 30 years, and that careful had preserved it. She knew that careful was now her responsibility. She thought about the phone call she hadn't made yet, the one to Claire in Baton Rouge. Claire, who had said practically, when Nora mentioned the storage auction that morning, the single word delivered in the flat effect of a woman who'd heard enough impractical plans to have stopped engaging with them charitably. Claire, who was not wrong about most things, and who would be very specifically wrong about this, and who Nora would have to tell eventually, but not tonight. Tonight, Claire existed in the category of things that could wait. She thought about the appraiser who'd asked her to send photos and not yet called back. She thought about the woman at the Whitney who didn't yet know this work existed. She thought about the 17 pages of analysis by a dead professor and the bill of sale signed by a living nephew who didn't know what else his uncle had sold. She thought about tomorrow being more than tonight was. She closed the journal, set it on the desk, turned off the lamp. Outside the gallery, River North hummed and glittered with its ordinary Tuesday night commerce, unaware. Inside, her children breathed slowly in the dark. In the adjacent room, in a climate-controlled space with proper humidity and light control, the paintings stood on their padded racks, waiting. She tried to think practically about what came next, but her mind kept returning instead to Eleanor Marsh at 21. Sitting at a dining table, she called the office, building something from nothing under conditions that didn't guarantee success. To Eleanor at 33, standing in a kitchen at 7 in the morning after a phone call from Robert Kessler, very still, very careful, holding a 12-year certainty that had just been confirmed. To Eleanor at 59 or 60, still sick, still running out of time, writing a letter she'd been trying to write for 3 years and finally finishing, because the alternative was not finishing. The shape of it, all of it, was the same shape. The shape of someone who kept going when the reasons to stop were more numerous and more obvious than the reasons to continue. Nora had no illusions about what the next weeks held. There would be experts who needed convincing, documents that needed authenticating, processes that moved on the timeline of institutions rather than the timeline of people who had $43 and nowhere to sleep. There would be Claire calling when she found out, convinced Nora had been manipulated somehow, by the appraiser or the auction or her own hope. There would be forms and legal checks, and the particular bureaucracy that attached itself to significant things like a slow secondary process that had to be completed before the significant thing could become real. She would do all of it. She would be careful. She would not fall apart until she understood the full shape, and then she would fall apart briefly and put herself back together, because that was also something the last 18 months had taught her was possible. She lay down on the couch and stayed very still, listening to her children breathe in the quiet of the room. She thought about the letter, about "I hope you need this," about a woman writing at a kitchen table to a stranger she'd never meet, taking care with each sentence, making sure the information was precise and the path forward was clear, trusting that whoever found it would be the kind of person who could use it carefully. Eleanor Marsh had been poor once. She had become careful. She had spent 30 years being careful, building file by file, acquisition by acquisition, analysis by analysis. And at the end of it, when there was no more time for anything else, she had written a letter to someone who needed it and left it where it could be found. Nora closed her eyes. She needed it. She had it. Tomorrow she would begin to understand fully what that meant, and what it could be made into, and what Eleanor Marsh had trusted in the careful and deliberate act of writing that letter to no one and leaving it in the right place at the right time, that the right person would do with it when she finally arrived. She woke at 5:47 a.m. to the sound of the gallery's front door, a specific sound, a key in a lock, then the slight resistance of a door that sat a little crooked in its frame, then the push of it opening. She lay still for a moment, tracking the sound, then remembered where she was. The couch in the back office. River North. Patricia Helms's gallery. The paintings in the next room. Marcus was asleep on the floor. Lily had migrated at some point to the small rug near the desk, curled on her side with her jacket as a blanket. The room smelled like the remains of the deli sandwiches and the particular air of a building that had been locked overnight. She heard footsteps moving through the gallery with the assurance of someone who knew exactly where everything was. Then a pause, and the sound she'd half expected, the door to the climate-controlled storage room opening. Patricia Helms examining the work at 6 in the morning because she had not, apparently, been able to stop thinking about it. Nora got up quietly and went to the bathroom. She showered for the first time in 2 days and stood under the water for perhaps a minute longer than she needed to, because it was warm and she could. She dressed in the cleanest clothes from the duffel bag, found the hotel bar of soap she'd been carrying since the last time they'd stayed somewhere that had soap, and used it. When she came out, Patricia Helms was in the doorway between the storage room and the office, holding a coffee she must have made in the small kitchen. She was wearing different clothes than yesterday, which meant she'd been home and come back. Dr. Kwan confirmed, Patricia Helms said. She'll be here at 10. Nora looked at the clock on the wall. 5:59 a.m. You called her last night. I called her at midnight. She called back at 2. That's how Sandra operates. Patricia Helms handed over the coffee, a second cup she'd been carrying in her other hand, an act of preparation that said more about her confidence in the situation than anything she'd said out loud. She doesn't return calls at 2 in the morning for things that don't warrant it. Nora took the coffee and held it in both hands and looked through the open storage room door at the Bellings landscape in its padded rack. The early morning light from the high window fell across the upper corner of it, the wide painted sky, and in that light the ochre and gray held differently than they had under the lamp last night. She thought about what Lily had said. This one wanted you to feel it. What do we tell the children? Nora asked. Patricia Helms considered the question as though it were legitimate rather than simple. Tell them a doctor is coming to examine the paintings. Same thing you'd say if a doctor were coming to examine someone important. Marcus appeared in the doorway, sleep-creased, bare under his arm. He looked at Patricia Helms, at his mother, at the coffee. A doctor is coming, Nora said, to look at the paintings. Marcus processed this. Like a checkup? Patricia Helms looked at him. Exactly like a checkup. He nodded. Okay. Is there breakfast? Dr. Sandra Kwan arrived at 9:53 with a leather case that held equipment Nora couldn't name and a manner that held no unnecessary words. She was perhaps 60, Chinese-American, with the specific kind of authority that came from having been correct many times in a field where being wrong had consequences. She shook Patricia Helms's hand with the recognition of professional allies. She shook Nora's hand and looked at her directly for one moment, reading something she didn't comment on, and then she went into the storage room and closed the door. They waited. Lily sat on the couch with her homework, not doing it, holding the notebook and looking at the closed door. Marcus sat beside her and did do his homework, because Marcus found comfort in tasks that had clear answers, and his math worksheet had clear answers, and the closed door did not. Patricia Helms stood near the kitchen drinking her second coffee, with the controlled patience of someone who had done this before and knew that impatience did not change what happened behind closed doors. Nora sat at the desk with Eleanor's journal. She read 12 more pages, the entries from 1986 through 1988, Eleanor establishing the North Michigan Avenue address, and describing it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had worked towards something specific and arrived. Then she found herself unable to read further. She set the journal on the desk and looked at the closed door the way the others were trying not to look at it. She thought about what was happening behind it. Dr. Kwan examining the drawing with tools and knowledge Nora didn't have, reading things in the paper and the marks that were invisible to unschooled eyes. She thought about Eleanor doing the same thing in 1991, holding the drawing for the first time after buying it for $40 as part of a lot, recognizing something, not knowing what she was recognizing, but feeling it in the way Eleanor had described in the journal, like a difference in temperature you can't not feel once you've felt it. She thought about 12 years of carrying that recognition before Robert Kessler gave it a name. She thought about the committee that had deferred in 2004 and Eleanor assembling her response and running out of time before it was assembled. She thought about the 48 hours that had become 2 months that had become this moment, a closed door in a gallery in River North on a Wednesday morning in November while her children sat on a green couch, trying to be patient. The door to the storage room opened at 12:17 p.m. Dr. Kwan came out. She set her leather case on the desk, opened it, removed her examination gloves, folded them. She looked at Patricia Helms first, then at Nora. "Tell me about the acquisition," she said to Nora. Nora told her. The auction notice, the $5 bid, the sealed unit, the cedar smell, the frames against the left wall, the letter, the Kessler document in the second drawer of the filing cabinet. She told it in the order it happened, without editorializing, the way she used to present project reports to clients. Here is the sequence. Here are the facts in sequence. Here is where we are. Dr. Kwan listened without interruption. When Nora finished, she was quiet for a moment. Kessler was careful, she said. The 2001 spectral analysis was conducted at a level of detail that wasn't standard practice at the time. He paid for access to equipment and methodology that went beyond what the academic budget usually allowed. She paused, meaning he was convinced enough to spend money on conviction. Is that unusual? Robert Kessler did not spend institutional resources on things he wasn't certain about. It was noted about him, not always positively. She picked up her case. The committee's 2004 deferral was not a rejection. It was a request for additional documentation that Eleanor Marsh was assembling when she died. The correspondence in her cedar chest. She looked at Patricia Helms, who confirmed with a nod. Completes the record she was building. It answers the specific questions the committee raised. The room was very quiet. Lily had stopped pretending to do homework. Marcus had his pencil in his hand and had not moved it for several minutes. "Dr. Kwan," Nora said. "Is it his?" Sandra Kwan looked at her. She had the face of someone who had been asked this question many times about many things and had learned that the answer required the full weight of its consequence to be placed on it before it was given. "The attribution is sound," she said. "The documentation is complete. The committee will have what it needs." A pause. "Yes, it's his." The sound that came out of Nora was not a word. It was the sound of something held a long time releasing, a breath that had been waiting since she'd read the subject line of the Kessler document the previous morning. She pressed her hand over her mouth and stood there and did not fall apart, because she'd told herself she wouldn't fall apart yet. But the sound came out anyway, and there was nothing to be done about that. Marcus got up from the couch and crossed to her and put his arms around her waist, the way he had since he was small enough for it to be a different gesture. She put her hand on his head. Lily was still on the couch. Her face was doing the complicated thing it did when multiple feelings arrived simultaneously, and she was trying to process them individually without letting any of them take over. After a moment, she said, very quietly, "Dad would have known. He would have known just from looking at it." Nora looked at her daughter across the room. "Yeah," she said. "He would have." Patricia Helms made calls that afternoon that Nora was not part of, in the quiet efficiency of someone working channels that operated on different frequencies than the ones Nora had access to. Nora understood this and let it happen, focusing instead on the things she could control, finding them more stable temporary housing, calling the shelter on Dewberry to let them know the space could go to whoever was next on the list, and calling Claire. Claire answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been thinking about Nora and had her phone somewhere close. "I found out what's in the storage unit," Nora said. Silence. Then, and "I need you to listen for a minute and not say anything until I finish." Claire's silence had a quality she'd learned to read over 40 years of being sisters. This one was the silence of someone who was being careful. "Okay," Claire said. Nora told her. She told her about Eleanor Marsh and the letter and the Kessler document and Patricia Helms and Dr. Sandra Kwan. She told her about the Bellings paintings and the drawing and the committee deferral that had become a complete record with the addition of Eleanor's correspondence. She told her the name on the subject line of the attribution document. She finished. Claire said nothing for a moment. Then, "Nora, I know. That's not possible. I thought so too. Dr. Kwan is from the Whitney. She's been on the catalog raisonné committee for 11 years. She says the attribution is sound." Another silence. "How much?" Patricia says comparable works have sold between 2 and 4 million. She thinks this one, given the documentation and the completeness of the provenance, is above the midpoint. Above the, Claire stopped. Started again. And the paintings, the Bellings. Patricia estimates 800,000 to 1.2 million total for both. She says the market will respond to their appearance because they're from his last productive period and they're not currently in any valuation record. Claire was quiet for so long that Nora checked the phone to see if the call had dropped. Nora, I told you it was impractical. I know. I told you not to waste the $5. You said practically, not don't go. You said one word. But yes, essentially. Another pause, and then a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else that used a laugh's mechanics. I'm sorry, Claire said. I should have gone with you. I should have helped you look through it. You're in Baton Rouge. I should have driven. Nora sat with that for a moment. The apology was genuine. She knew Claire well enough to know that. It was also the kind of apology that came easier after success had been confirmed, which she didn't say because Claire knew it too, and saying it didn't help anything. Come for Christmas, Nora said. Bring everyone. We'll have room. The week that followed had the texture of waiting with activity inside it, which was a different texture than waiting alone. Patricia Helms managed the authentication process, submitting the complete documentation package to the Catalog Raisonné Committee and simultaneously opening conversations with 2 auction houses who had, according to Patricia, already expressed interest once she described what was coming without naming it specifically. The committee moved faster than expected, which Patricia attributed to the quality of the documentation. The Kessler analysis plus the Whitney correspondence plus the original acquisition record going back to the 1991 estate sale. It was, she said, a cleaner provenance chain than most discovered works presented. Eleanor had understood that the chain needed to be unbroken from the moment of acquisition. Nora moved them into a furnished short-term rental Patricia found through someone she knew, a studio apartment in Lincoln Park available for 3 months that had 2 rooms and a kitchen and beds that were real beds and not the floor. She paid for the first month on the credit card that was in collections, which worked, and made a note of the amount with the specific intention of paying it in full as soon as she was able, which was a thought she had not been able to think without qualification for 2 years. The kids went back to school. Marcus returned to his classroom and told his teacher, when she asked how he'd been, that he and his mom had found some important paintings in a storage unit, and now they had a new apartment. His teacher called Nora to check that everything was all right, and Nora confirmed that it was, and the teacher said she was glad with the warmth of someone who'd watched Marcus carefully for 2 months and been worried about what she was seeing. Lily went back and said nothing to her friends about any of it. Nora noticed this and understood it as wisdom. The particular wisdom of a 14-year-old who'd learned that telling people things before they were settled created problems that settled things didn't have. On the 9th day after the auction, Nora received an email from a committee address she'd been given by Patricia Helms. It was 4 paragraphs, formal, the language of institutional confirmation. The last sentence of the 3rd paragraph read, "The committee finds the attribution well supported by the documentation provided and will include this work in the forthcoming supplement to the Catalog Raisonné under the designation EH/1931/Landscape Study, formerly Collection Eleanor Marsh, currently Collection in Callahan." Nora read it twice. Then she called Patricia Helms. "I know," Patricia said before Nora spoke. "They sent me a copy. We're confirmed." The Bellings paintings went to auction first because they had the simpler provenance, a signed bill of sale, a notarized document, direct acquisition from the artist, and Eleanor's 30 years of careful ownership. Patricia placed them with a house in New York that specialized in American post-war and contemporary work. The specialist there, a man named Gary who spoke with the slightly accelerated enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for something to arrive, said that the appearance of 2 unrecorded Bellings from his late period would create the kind of auction room attention that was difficult to engineer and impossible to fake. He was right. The first Bellings, the street scene with the deep red sign and the 2 figures caught mid-stride, sold in March for $490,000. Nora was in the Lincoln Park apartment when it sold, watching the live auction feed on her laptop while Marcus ate cereal at the small kitchen table and Lily sat on the couch with her homework, actually doing it this time. She'd been awake since 5. Not from anxiety exactly, but from the particular alertness that came when something was about to become real that had previously only been documented on paper. The auction started at 10. By 11 it had worked through 30 lots and arrived at theirs. The estimate on the catalog page Patricia had sent read $280,000 to $380,000, which was conservative and knew it was conservative. The telephone bidders drove it past the high estimate in 4 increments. Then 2 of them kept going. The room at the auction house was visible in the corner of the screen, a small window showing the auctioneer and the assembled bidders and the board with the climbing number, and Nora watched the number climb the way she'd watched certain graphs and project reports, with the part of her brain that tracked data and the part that was also her watching it in her kitchen with her children nearby, while the number became something she hadn't let herself believe it would become. The bid climbed in increments that at first felt slow and then suddenly didn't. 2 telephone bidders driving it past the estimate, and then past the high estimate, and then into a space that hadn't been named beforehand, because nobody had wanted to name it and be wrong. When the hammer came down, the number on the screen was $490,000. Marcus looked at the number. He put down his spoon. Is that real? Yes. He picked up his spoon again. He ate another bite of cereal. He said, in the tone he used when he was filing something important. Okay. Lily closed her homework notebook. She looked at the screen for a moment, then at her mother. The second one will be more, she said. Because now they know. She was right about that too. The landscape, the large format painting with the wide sky that Thomas Bellings had made in 1991 and sold to Eleanor for $400, sold 3 weeks later for $680,000. The same 2 telephone bidders drove it again, and this time a third joined. Gary, the auction specialist, called Patricia afterward and used the word exceptional twice in a single sentence, which she told Nora was not something Gary did. Patricia Helms called Nora 10 minutes after the hammer came down. She said the number, then let the silence be what it was for a moment. Gary sends his regards, she said. He wants you to know it was the cleanest auction he's run in 5 years. No disputes, no reserves triggered, clean sales to legitimate buyers. Nora was in the kitchen. She had been making coffee when the phone rang, and she was still holding the empty coffee pot, which she realized now and set down carefully. And the drawing, she said. That goes to the specialized sale in May. The committee confirmation is now attached to the lot. The catalog essay is being written by Sandra Kwan. She offered to do that. She said Eleanor deserved a proper catalog essay. She said she owed Eleanor's memory that much for the committee's delay. A pause. Sandra is not a person who uses the word "oh" lightly. The May sale was not a live auction she could watch on a laptop at the kitchen table. The specialized works on paper sale was conducted in a room in New York with a particular kind of quiet that specialized sales had, the quiet of people who knew exactly what they were looking at and were choosing very carefully what to show each other about what they thought. Patricia attended in person. She sat in the room and sent Nora brief text messages in the shorthand of someone who didn't want to look at their phone but was making an exception. Lot comes up in 20 minutes. Room has 7 phone bidders registered. That's significant. Kwan's essay is in the catalog. People are reading it. Some are reading it a second time. Then nothing for 11 minutes. Then a message that was only a number. $3,240,000. Nora sat in the Lincoln Park apartment with her phone in her hand and the number on the screen. Outside, a bus went past on the street below. Someone in the apartment above walked from one room to another. The city moved around the number the way the city had been moving around everything that had happened since November. Unknowing and ongoing and entirely unchanged. She was not unchanged. She set the phone down on the kitchen table, face up, the number still visible. She looked at it for a while. She thought about Eleanor Marsh writing the last pages of that letter, the handwriting slightly less steady than the first pages, the pen moving with the effort of someone who was running low on what it took to make the pen move. The final sentence in the same careful cursive as the opening. I hope you need this. She thought about the $5 entry bid. She thought about the Marshall at 8:51 in the morning and the Kia loaded with 4 boxes and 2 duffel bags and the 3 annotated art books she'd kept because she wasn't ready to let go. She thought about Marcus pressing his hands flat against the carpet in his room, checking that the floor was still there. She thought about Lily saying fine in the voice that meant not fine. She thought about Daniel in the garage on Saturdays, paying attention to the difference between what was correct and what was true. She picked up the phone and called Lily's school. The secretary put her through to the classroom. "This is Lily Callahan's mother. Can you tell Lily that everything is going to be okay? She'll know what I mean." A pause. The sound of the secretary crossing a room, and a door, and then Lily's voice, slightly guarded in the way school voices were when things were unexpected. "Mom, everything is going to be okay," Nora said. "I wanted you to know before I told you anything else." A long pause. "The hopper?" "Yes." Another pause. And then the sound of Lily breathing, just breathing, and Nora understood that her daughter had been carrying this too, had been carrying it quietly in the way she'd been taught to carry things quietly, and was now being allowed to put it down. She thought about all the things Lily had been quietly carrying over the last 2 years. The nights she'd come home from school and checked her mother's face before she said anything. The afternoon she'd stood in a storage unit and read a legal document and asked the right question about the termination clause. The way she'd sat in the gallery back office that first night, looking through the open door at the painting against the padded rack and not saying what she was thinking. 14 years old, carrying things that most adults put down when they got too heavy. Lily had not put them down. She'd only waited until she was allowed to. "Okay," Lily said. "Okay, I'm going to go back to class now." "Go back to class," Nora said. "I'll make dinner tonight." She called Marcus's school and left a message with his teacher. Everything was fine. She would explain tonight. Could his teacher let him know his mom said everything was fine? The teacher said of course, and said it with the warmth of someone who understood what everything's fine sounded like when it was actually true. She called Claire. Claire answered on the first ring. "It's sold," Nora said. "How much?" Nora told her. Claire made a sound that had no precise category. Then she said, with the directness of someone who had decided that honesty was the only currency that mattered at this point, "I told you it was impractical." "You did. And you went anyway." "I did. Because you had $47 and nothing to lose. And a storage unit nobody else wanted," Nora said. And a letter from a woman who understood what it meant to start with nothing and be careful. Claire was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed to the voice from childhood, the voice beneath the practical voice, the one that came out when things were too large for the practical voice to manage alone. "Mom would have loved this story." "Yeah," Nora said. "She would." In the weeks that followed, Nora moved through the financial mechanics of what had happened with the same systematic attention she'd once brought to project management for companies, the skill set reasserting itself in a context it fit much better than offices and time zones. The auction proceeds, less Patricia Helms's 15%, less the auction house's buyers' premiums and sellers' commissions, settled into an account that was real and documented and had her name on it. For $1,216,000. After all the fees and percentages and the things that came off the top of large numbers when large numbers moved through legitimate channels. She sat with her accountant, a woman named Deb who had been working with modest earners her whole career and received this particular situation with the professional equanimity of someone who had decided long ago that her job was to be useful regardless of the size of the number. Deb said taxes first, then debts, then the rest. They did taxes first, then debts. The medical debt was $189,000 at origination. With interest and collection fees, it had grown to $214,000. She paid it in full on a Thursday morning, authorized the wire transfer, and sat quietly in Deb's office for a moment afterward while Deb made notes. It was not a dramatic moment from the outside. Inside it felt like the removal of something that had been in her chest for 2 years, not painful exactly in its removal, but noticeable. The way you noticed the absence of something you'd stopped registering as present. She thought of Daniel at the hospital, the specific look on his face when the billing department called the room to discuss the options. He'd held Nora's hand and said it doesn't matter, we'll figure it out, and they had figured it out, and the figuring out had cost them the house and the savings and 2 years of her life, and none of that was the wrong choice because there had been no wrong choice, only the weight of the exchange. The exchange was paid now. All of it. She felt the weight lift with a specific and physical sensation she hadn't expected, and she sat with it until Deb finished her notes and looked up, and Deb, who had been doing this work long enough to know what this moment looked like, said nothing about it and moved to the next item on the list. She paid the credit cards. She paid the legal fees from the divorce that had never quite closed. She paid the 3 months of unpaid rent to Bertrand. her former landlord, including an additional amount she wasn't required to pay that represented her best estimate of the trouble and expense he'd absorbed on her behalf before filing. She wrote a note with the check. "Thank you for the patience. I don't know if you know what it meant to us." She sealed it and mailed it without expecting a response and received one anyway, a handwritten note on a card that said, "I do know. Good luck to your family." She bought a house. Not immediately, not impulsively, but with the careful attention of someone who understood that the purchase was also a commitment to staying, to choosing a place and meaning it. She spent 6 weeks looking, with Lily and Marcus along for every viewing, because this was their house as much as hers, and they had opinions she intended to honor. She told them both on the first morning of looking what she hadn't said in precisely those terms before. "This is not temporary. We are finding a place to stay." She said it the way she said things she needed them to trust, with the directness that had replaced the careful approximations she'd used in the worst period, when truth had required so much wrapping to be survivable. Lily's requirements, stated plainly on the drive to the first viewing: a room with good morning light and a door that locked. Marcus's requirements: a yard and somewhere to build things. Nora's requirements were less easily named. She would know it when she stood in the kitchen and the light came through the window at the right angle. She would know it when it felt like something that deserved to be taken seriously. The house they settled on was in a neighborhood close to the kids' schools, a 3-bedroom 2-story with a yard that had a pear tree in it and a small detached structure at the back that had been used as a workshop. Marcus saw the workshop and walked straight to it, and stood in the doorway looking at the interior with his hands at his sides in the posture he'd inherited from Daniel, the posture of someone standing in front of something that required full attention. "Can this be for building things?" he asked. "Yes," Nora said. He turned around. He looked at his mother with the particular look he'd been giving her since November, the look that said he was still processing the fact that things had changed but was trying to do it quietly. "Dad would have liked this house. He would have had opinions about the porch rail," Nora said. "He would have rebuilt it." Marcus looked at the porch rail. "It's a little crooked. We'll fix it." Lily chose the room with the best morning light, which was a choice Daniel would have understood and approved of. She set up her desk under the window and put her books on the shelf she and Nora assembled together one Sunday afternoon, following the instructions more carefully than was strictly necessary because Lily brought this quality to all assembly tasks. She didn't decorate the room the way Nora had expected a 14-year-old to decorate. No posters, no string lights. One thing on the wall above the desk: a photograph of Daniel, taken the last summer before the diagnosis, in the garage, holding a paintbrush and looking at something outside the frame of the picture with the expression he wore when he was figuring out what the next mark needed to be. Nora saw it one morning from the doorway and stood there for a moment without saying anything. Lily noticed her. "Is that okay?" "That's more than okay," Nora said. The 2 smaller paintings, the portrait and the interior study, sold through Patricia's gallery in the late spring for a combined $38,000. The 3 glassine envelope drawings from Eleanor's Cedar chest sold at the same specialized sale as the Hopper for $44,000 total. The documents alone, Eleanor's 30 years of acquisition records, were acquired by the Art Institute of Chicago for their archive, which Patricia had negotiated at Nora's specific request rather than treating as an aside. The price was modest, $12,000, but the Institute's archivist said that Eleanor Marsh's records were among the most complete she had encountered for a dealer of that period, and that researchers would be using them for decades. Nora had wanted the records to go somewhere they would be used. Eleanor had been careful. The careful deserved to be seen. She set up the Eleanor Marsh Foundation in the fall, with Deb's help and the guidance of a nonprofit attorney Patricia recommended. Its stated purpose was simple in the way that simple purposes were when they came from specific rather than abstract understanding. Emergency housing assistance for families facing homelessness as a result of sudden financial loss, specifically covering the gap between crisis and the next solid ground. Not long-term support, not structural intervention, just time. The 48 hours extended into weeks, the space to look clearly at what you had and figure out what to do with it. She had thought about what to name it for longer than she'd thought about most things. The Eleanor Marsh Foundation was the name she kept returning to because Eleanor had earned it. Not because Eleanor had been wealthy or prominent or recognized while she was alive, but because Eleanor had understood something important and had built her whole working life around it, and had passed it forward when she ran out of time to do more herself. That deserved a name on a door. The first case the foundation funded was a family of 4 in Lincoln Square. A father who'd lost his job to a medical emergency. A mother working 2 part-time jobs to cover a gap the numbers said couldn't be covered. 2 kids in elementary school. They needed 8 weeks of stabilized rent while the father's disability claim processed. The foundation covered it. Nora didn't meet them. That wasn't the structure she'd designed. The cases were handled by Mariella and the staff, because the people who needed help didn't need to feel grateful to a person. They needed to feel supported by a system that saw them. Systems were less fragile than people. Eleanor had understood that too. The careful thing was the thing that didn't require a witness to keep working. She funded it with $300,000 from the auction proceeds, enough to operate for several years before it needed to sustain itself through donations. Patricia served on the board. So did Deb. So did a woman named Mariella from the Salvation Army shelter on Dewberry Street, who had been the intake coordinator there for 12 years and knew better than anyone what families needed in the first 72 hours and what they could figure out for themselves if someone just gave them the room to do it. In December, Nora drove to the gallery one last time to collect the final item Patricia had been holding, the Bellings oil study she hadn't sold. Not because it was unsellable, but because she hadn't been able to make herself sell it. Patricia had watched her hesitate twice when it was listed and finally said, with the bluntness she reserved for things that needed bluntness, "Keep it." Eleanor would have kept it. She'd written a letter of provenance to go with it and charged nothing for the service. It was the street scene, the one with the 2 figures mid-stride and the shop window with its deep red sign and the wet pavement catching the last of the artificial light. She hung it in the living room of the new house, above the fireplace, where the morning light from the east window would catch it at a certain angle and the afternoon light would catch it differently, and both would be worth looking at. Marcus stood in front of it on a Saturday morning, January, 3 weeks after they'd moved in. He was eating toast. He looked at the 2 figures, at the street, at the quality of the light on the pavement. "They're going somewhere," he said. "Yeah, but you don't know where." "No, that's on purpose." He considered this, the way he considered things that were on purpose, seriously, as though purpose deserved acknowledgement. "It feels like they're going to be okay, though." Nora looked at the painting. The 2 figures were in the middle of a motion. Coats, dusk, the city going about its business around them. They had somewhere to be, and they were going there, and the shop behind them threw its light generously onto the street without expecting anything in return, and the wet pavement held the reflection of everything above it. And there was nothing in the painting that promised what came next, but there was also nothing in it that suggested what came next would be worse than what had already been. "Yeah," she said. "I think they are." She read the last entry of Eleanor's journal in February. She'd been working through it slowly, a few pages at a time, treating it the way she'd come to treat most things she didn't want to finish, carefully, not rushing the end. The last entry was dated 2 months before Eleanor died, and it was shorter than most. It read, "I have been trying to decide whether to give the work away outright, to leave it to an institution, to have Patricia sell it and distribute the proceeds. I have had this conversation with myself 100 times, and I always arrive at the same place. I don't know who should have it. I know that the right person will find it if I leave it to be found. I have based my whole career on the idea that things find their way to the people who need them and can see them. And if I stop believing that now, I have to admit I never believed it at all. The letter is written. The unit is paid through the end. The key to the chest is under the tissue paper in room 3. The rest is up to whoever comes. I hope they need it. I hope they know what it is." Nora set the journal down on the kitchen table of the house she owned. In the neighborhood her children walked through every morning on their way to school. In the city where a woman she'd never met had spent 30 years being careful so that the thing she'd built would still be there when the right person found it. She had read the journal from 1981 to the final entry over the course of 3 months. Not because it took 3 months to read, but because she'd read it the way Eleanor had built the collection, deliberately, returning to passages, letting time work on what she'd read before she moved forward. Eleanor at 21, eating cheaper lunches and building something. Eleanor at 33, receiving a phone call at 7 in the morning and sitting very still in her kitchen. Eleanor at 50, writing about what it meant to be a dealer, not a salesperson, not a merchant, but a person who moved things from the place where they were invisible to the place where they could be seen. Eleanor at 59, deciding not to decide where the collection went, choosing instead to trust the weight of accumulated careful work to find its own landing. She thought about the morning she'd been sitting on the floor of an empty apartment at 4:42 a.m., doing the math that didn't work, and had thought, $5. The unit might have something worth selling. She thought about the cedar smell when the door rolled up and the quality of the wrapping on the frames, the intention in it, the tape that had held 2 years, and the twine that had held longer than that. She thought about a woman she'd never met, sitting alone in a kitchen somewhere in this city, writing a letter at the end of her life to someone she would never meet either, and trusting that the distance between them was crossable. She thought about how much that trust had cost. She thought about how it had been honored. She thought about what it meant to be careful. Not careful in the sense of cautious, not careful in the sense of self-protective, but careful in the original sense, full of care, paying attention, treating things as though their value was real, even when no one else had confirmed it yet. Eleanor had been careful for 30 years. She had taught herself to look at things correctly, and looking correctly was a kind of love that did not require the love thing to know it was loved. She thought about all the moments in the last year that had required her to pay attention rather than react. The choice to open the unit instead of letting it sit. The choice to read the letter in full before deciding anything. The choice to ask Patricia Helms for everything in writing before she touched a single frame. The choice to be present in Dr. Kwan's examination without performing patients she didn't feel. The choice to pay Bertrand the money she didn't owe him, because owing was not the same as having received something worth acknowledging. None of these were dramatic choices. None of them had a visible moment of risk. They were the accumulated small choices of someone trying to honor a trust they'd been given by someone who couldn't see whether the trust was warranted. She thought about the letter's last sentence one more time. I hope you need this. Nora had needed it. She had been careful with it. She had tried to do with it what Eleanor had done with everything she'd spent 30 years acquiring. Pass it forward to whoever came next with enough care that it would still be useful when they arrived. Outside, the city was doing what it did. The Foundation's first family would come next week. The Eleanor Marsh archive at the Art Institute was cataloged and open to researchers. The Bellings landscape was hanging somewhere in a collector's house, in a room where someone looked at it and felt the sky. The Hopper drawing, in an institution now, would be seen by people who had no idea it had spent 12 years in a dealer's private collection and 2 more years in a storage unit in a lot on Clement Street, acquired for $5 by a woman who'd had $47 and been careful with what she found. Nora Callahan had no illusions about luck. She understood that luck was not what had happened. What had happened was Eleanor Marsh spending 30 years building something worth finding and being careful enough about how she left it that it would wait for the right person. What had happened was a woman with nothing deciding that $5 was worth spending on a question she didn't know the answer to. What had happened was 2 children who'd learned to be quiet and patient and present in the way children learned things when adults showed them it was worth learning. What had happened was the gap between a locked unit and an open one being crossed by someone who had enough left to cross it, and what was inside being there because someone else had been careful enough to leave it. In the workshop at the back of the yard, Marcus had begun building something. She didn't know what yet. He'd asked for wood and basic tools and time on Saturdays, and she'd given him all 3. And on Saturday mornings, she could hear from the kitchen the sound of work, the specific sound of someone learning what it could do and what it couldn't, making mistakes and understanding them and trying again. It was the same sound she'd heard from Daniel's garage on Saturday mornings for years, and it landed in her chest the same way those sounds had landed, as evidence of something being built, as proof that building was happening, as the particular quiet comfort of knowing that the person you loved was in a room nearby, making something real. Lily came down to breakfast one morning with a book under her arm that Nora recognized. One of the 3 annotated art books, Daniel's handwriting in the margins. She poured herself cereal and set the book on the table beside the bowl and opened it to a page she'd marked with a folded piece of paper. Can I read you something? Lily asked. Yes. She read a paragraph Daniel had marked heavily with his blue pen, a later annotation, from the period when he'd been paying attention in the way you paid attention when you knew time was doing something you hadn't planned for. The paragraph was about the relationship between patience and vision, the argument that the ability to see something clearly depended on the willingness to keep looking after looking had stopped feeling productive. That the moment most people looked away was usually the moment before the thing revealed itself. Lily closed the book. She ate her cereal. Dad wrote next to it, "The whole job is staying." Nora looked at her daughter, at the bowl of cereal and the annotated book in the window behind her showing the yard, and the pear tree and the workshop at the back, where Marcus was already making sounds of work on a Saturday morning. "The whole job is staying," she said. Outside, the city was doing what it did. The Foundation's first family would come next week. The Eleanor Marsh archive at the Art Institute was cataloged and open to researchers. The Bellings landscape was hanging somewhere in a collector's house, in a room where someone looked at it and felt the sky. The Hopper drawing, in an institution now, would be seen by people who had no idea it had spent 12 years in a dealer's private collection and 2 more years in a storage unit in a lot on Clement Street, acquired for $5 by a woman who'd had $47 and been careful with what she found. Nora Callahan had no illusions about luck. She understood that luck was not what had happened. What had happened was Eleanor Marsh spending 30 years building something worth finding and being careful enough about how she left it that it would wait for the right person. What had happened was a woman with nothing deciding that $5 was worth spending on a question she didn't know the answer to. What had happened was 2 children who'd learned to be quiet and patient and present in the way children learned things when adults showed them it was worth learning. What had happened was the gap between a locked unit and an open one being crossed by someone who had enough left to cross it, and what was inside being there because someone else had been careful enough to leave it. She thought about the letter's last sentence one more time. "I hope you need this." Nora had needed it. She had been careful with it. She had tried to do with it what Eleanor had done with everything she'd spent 30 years acquiring. Pass it forward to whoever came next with enough care that it would still be useful when they arrived. She got up and put her dishes in the sink and walked out to the workshop, where Marcus was standing at the workbench looking at a piece of wood with his hands at his sides and that expression on his face, the one she'd loved in Daniel and recognized in her son. The expression of someone in front of something that required full attention before the first mark was made. She stood in the doorway and watched him look. He had Daniel's posture in this specific moment, the stillness of someone who understood that looking was not a preliminary to the work but the beginning of it, that the time spent before the first mark was not wasted time, but the most important time, the time when you were deciding what you were trying to do and whether you understood enough to do it correctly. He reached out and ran his hand along the grain of the wood, reading it. Then he picked up the saw and began. She watched him for a while from the doorway, the morning light coming down into the yard at the angle it came in November, cold and clean and specific. The pear tree stood leafless and patient at the edge of the yard. The house was behind her, warm and present. The city was past the fence and the street and the next neighborhood over, going about its business, unknowing. She thought, "This is what staying looks like." She went back inside and made more coffee, and the saw kept going in the workshop, and the light kept moving the way light moved, and the day continued to be the kind of day that didn't announce itself as significant but was. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.